Welcome to the ASEAN Wonk podcast, where we bring you expert insights and regional perspectives on Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Paramaswaran. If you haven't already, do subscribe to the ASEAN Wonk platform at www.aseanwonk.com so you don't miss our posts. Our guest today is Captain Sarabjeet Parmar, who retired last June from the Indian Navy after nearly 4 decades of service, dating back to 1987. He has written and spoken widely on a range of topics, including maritime security and doctrine in the Indo-Pacific region. He currently has various affiliations, including as Distinguished Fellow at the United Service Institution of India, as well as the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. We will start our conversation by talking about how to think about India's role in Southeast Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific, given its status as the world's most populous country and one of the centers of Indo-Pacific thinking on geopolitics and geoeconomics. Make sure you watch, listen, or read the full episode as we go through a range of other subjects, including U.S.-China competition and various other issues, including Myanmar, the South China Sea, and much, much more. So welcome to the podcast, Sarabjeet, and let's start, if we can, on India's defense ties with Southeast Asia. We last saw each other at an Indo-Pacific conference in Indonesia early this year, and there have been a number of defense-related touch points at play amid leader exchanges, including the deployment of Brahmos to the Philippines, the finalization of a defense credit line when the Vietnamese Prime Minister visited India. And as a practitioner and as someone who has worn the uniform, I'm wondering, how do you see these various developments on the defense side? Because you've had an opportunity to see this on a multi-decade period. And we also have a number of developments that keep popping up in the news, including Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who was just in India. And in terms of how to characterize this or quantify it, it would also be interesting to get your sense of, whatever characterization you would like to place on it, whether it's a letter grade or, between a scale of 1 to 10. What might you sort of say or give New Delhi in terms of its score with respect to India's Act East policy in Southeast Asia, given the fact that this is now this year entering into its 10th year, and we're seeing so many of these developments happening? How would you sort of characterize that?
Morning, Prashant. It's great to connect online, and thank you so much for this opportunity to come on board your platform. And that's a volley of questions. So let's start from the top then. All right. So, we must realize that many decades ago, let's go back to around the Look East policy time of around early 90s and 1990s. And that's the time, when India was coming out of sort of being accepted by the global community at some point in time. The Cold War was behind us. We were looking for new relations, which have now fructified into very strong strategic partnerships, especially with the US. And we were more aware that we need to engage various countries at various levels to come of our own and to be recognized as a maritime nation, as well as a growing regional and also at that point in time, Asia Pacific power. Indo-Pacific was not on the horizon at that point in time. And so the journey started off. And so we've come a long way since then. We have engaged the ASEAN nations bilaterally. There are a number of exercises we do. I'll give you certain examples as we go by and by. And then we've engaged ASEAN navies as an entity on its own in the last exercise we did with the ASEAN maritime forces. And plus, when you look at the relationships that have grown, and you mentioned a few, so let me take on a few right now. Vietnam, for example, there were a lot of commonalities between the defense equipment Vietnam had and India had, because the source was the same, coming from USSR and then, of course, Russia. And we have engaged Vietnam, and we even had a mobile training team positioned in Vietnam for training of crew and technical people on the Kamov aircraft, which is a common defense equipment. Then there were talks on submarines. We both had the SSKs of Russian origin, and therefore there was sort of talk. I don't know if it fructified at that point in time. And last year we gave corvette to the Vietnamese Navy. We've also had Vietnamese officers coming for training to India. I've been a directing staff at our Wellington Staff College, so we have officers from 40 nations who come. Some nations send 3 officers, some send 1, depending upon the understanding. But the presence is there. And then, of course, with Vietnam, we do also go sometime back into the past where there has been support between Vietnam and India. And then, of course, we've had certain differences in between. But as I said, after the Cold War, a lot of that ice has been broken. And today, when we look at the $300 million credit line, which you mentioned, it opens up an avenue for not only more interaction between the armed forces, but also the export opportunities for Indian defense industry, which is coming of age. And if you read the latest statistics, I mean, we have developed 2,300% from a certain baseline. But over time, that baseline will change and the percentages change. But it's an indication from where we have come. And 50% of our defense exports go to the US, which is a little surprising for many people. But we are looking at exporting defense equipment to other nations. And I think the advantage India has, and that goes especially for a lot of nations whose defense budgets are not that high, is that they do not require, too much of high-tech technology. What they need is something for boosting their capacities and capabilities. And more importantly, on the capability part is to maintain and sustain that equipment. And therefore, India provides that sort of equipment at not very expensive rates, but something that suits the requirement. It's something that we have understood and developed on our own, coming through what the Prime Minister says on Atmanirbhar. And so therefore, Southeast Asia provides an excellent market for India's exports. And if you look at the figures that come from SIPRI, Southeast Asia is perhaps one of the areas or part of the Indo-Pacific that imports a lot of defense equipment from outside. And so that's an opportunity there. And therefore, that's one example with Vietnam. But let me give you an example of Philippines here. So now, our relationship with Philippines on defense security was perhaps not that high a magnitude as it was with other Southeast Asian or Indo-Pacific nations. But over time, it has developed. And personally, I always felt that, whenever we sailed through the South China Sea, Philippines was sort of a void, which has changed. And that, I think, is great news on that part. And of course, I'd like to come to the sale of Brahmos missiles to the Philippines. And of course, before that, a little word on India's stance in South China Sea. And therefore, over time, India's remarks on South China Sea and the security situation have been somewhat guarded. And there's a reason for it. When you look at the statements deposited at the time of ratification of UNCLOS 3, there is alignment in India's and China's approach to certain aspects. One is innocent passage in territorial seas and military activities in the EZ. So India's approach has been very cautious. But last year, for the first time, we made a mention that, yes, the judgment of the arbitration between Philippines and China must be respected. So that's the first time that we've sort of taken a different view and made very clear what we are looking at, because that looks at stability. It does not necessarily encompass the alignment of the views, as I've just mentioned. It requires a modicum of enhancing stability, ensuring security and preserving peace. There's 3 pillars of India's approach to maritime security. It's been laid out in the Indian Maritime Security Strategy document of 2015. I was fortunate to be a part of the team that revised it. So I do know the contents in detail. So I think the sale of defense equipment to Southeast Asia is, in a way, not at, complicating the situation there, but enhancing the capacity and capabilities of those nations and increasing the deterrent value of their hard power, which I think they do need to project. And just to give you an example, the 3 batteries of Brahmos missiles, which India exported or sold to the Philippines a couple of months back, they reached the Philippines. And I think the early of this year it happened. And you can imagine those Brahmos missiles, given their speed and their range, actually provide a sort of a security blanket or a cover to a lot of the disputed islands that fall within the range of the Philippines. And given the nature of relations between China and Philippines, it's almost on a daily basis there seem to be, uh, collisions between their ships and Chinese presence, and the inability of Philippines to sustain its outposts is a matter of concern, especially where sovereignty is concerned. So this is a start point, and I think the start point has happened because of the increase in the Indian parts of the Brahmos missile. I do remember, I think in the early 2010s, around 2012 or so, I don't remember exactly, but there was talk of Vietnamese interest in Brahmos missiles. But I think at that point in time, we didn't have a good part of the components were not Indian, and so therefore there were other issues involved which are not available in the open domain, which sort of restricted or didn't let the sale or the talk of Brahmos missiles to Vietnam go through. But today we have many nations who are evincing an interest in Brahmos missiles. We have a lot of nations who are evincing an interest in the Tejas aircraft, in our advanced light helicopters. So these are defense equipment that will increase capacity and capability. And do remember, enhancing capacity and capability is one of the 7 pillars of the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. So this adds on to the Act East policy, right, which is under the overall umbrella of the vision of Sagar security and growth for all in the region. So when you take Sagar as a vision or even a concept, you can place it in any maritime area. It could be South China Sea, it could be Indian Ocean region, and when it was spoken about in 2015, that too in Mauritius by the Prime Minister. It was an idea that you can have it in the North Atlantic, you put it anywhere. No region was mentioned. So it's part of India's outreach of Sagar, security and growth for all in the region, looking at maritime security, and also looking at enhancing capacities and capabilities. So it helps not only those nations to have a higher deterrent value, or uh, a feeling of satisfaction that they will be able to protect their sovereignty, but also helps India in developing its own industrial base much more. So there is progress there. It's not only in the maritime element. For example, we do bilateral exercises with all the maritime nations of Southeast Asia. Whether it's let's start with the 3 nations who I always say are on the line between Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean region: Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia. We do coordinated patrols with them to address non-traditional security issues in the Bay of Bengal. But the only issue with these coordinated patrols or corpats is that they're restricted to either side of the international maritime boundary line. I think we need to cross that line, and therefore we need to be able to do more effective coordinated patrols, which requires, I think, much more. I think there is a little trust deficit in this, and that needs to be built upon. And that's maybe a residue of what I'd mentioned when I started pointing out that we've come from a point where India was seen as a threat in the 1990s to now we have a strategic relationship with almost all nations of the Indo-Pacific, and especially Southeast Asia. So we have these bilateral exercises. A lot of these nations attend the Milan exercises, which we conduct. We also have a trilateral between Singapore and Thailand. A lot of these nations come to India for training, as I said, and Singapore especially, we got a very strong relationship. I was commanding the Air Squadron in 2007 when we had the Malabar 2007-02, where we had 6 nations and around, I think, 35, 36 ships, submarines, and of course associated aircraft at sea. And out of the 6 nations, there was, of course, the Quad, if I can talk about it now. And of course, we had Singapore and United Kingdom also. Speaks volumes. And we've come a long way, and it's only after 14 years from 2007 we managed to have an exercise equivalent to what we did in 2007. So there is involvement, there is cooperation, there is an understanding of respect of sovereignty. And just to give you an example, if you look at all the statements deposited by nations after they ratified UNCLOS 3, you'll find there is an alignment. of thought processes on innocent passage, military activities in the EZ, skepticism, which was there in 1982 during the UNCLOS discussions were going on. Because most of these nations got independence after World War II, and most of them had been colonized. So there is a certain skepticism at that point in time that sovereignty is supreme. So therefore, they wanted to have a sort of a buffer to ensure that their sovereignty is protected. And down the line, that has followed. I always like to give this example that despite the differences on UNCLOS between India and the US, today we are the best of friends. We are working together. Quad is one example. Approach to the Indo-Pacific, free and open, is another example. Inclusivity, which India insists upon, is slowly working. And so, therefore, relationship with Southeast Asia will only increase. And how India tends to look at maybe what China's view of India's approach is a separate issue. That is a bilateral issue. And so while we will still be maybe reserved on our comments on the situation in South China Sea, but I think this defense relationships is meant to enhance the capacity and capability of Southeast Asian nations. And I'll pause there for the time being so that we can roll on other questions.
No, that's fantastic sort of specifics there on interactions. And that's one of the benefits that you have with that extensive experience, to be able to view these relationships over a longer period of time. I'm wondering, to that question that you mentioned earlier about India and China, there is that bilateral component. There also is the fact that Southeast Asian countries are looking at the overall regional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, and India matters significantly in that sort of balance of power. There are the sort of positive manifestations that you mentioned earlier. We're seeing that with India's use of, you mentioned the Quad, you mentioned Brahmos. We talked about some of the earlier iterations with some Southeast Asian countries as well. There also is, periods of sort of, the headlines and, new surveys that come out that sort of serve as a bit of a mixed sort of bag, right, when it comes to India and its evaluation of Southeast Asian countries. So I'll mention a couple. One is the Asia Foundation survey, which we cited in the ASEAN Wonk newsletter that came out just a few weeks ago, actually. And it looked at Thailand and Thai popular perception. So this is a public sort of survey. And it found that when it comes to overall engagement between major powers, only 6% of Thais thought that, India was kind of very important for the country's future, right? Relative to China was at 56%, the US was at 36%. In fairness, a lot of the other countries were hovering at around, 20%, right? Like Europe as a collective entity, Japan, Australia was at 11%. But nonetheless, these do produce periodic headlines about, to what extent, how do we understand India's importance? And then the other one, which is quite widely cited, is the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, or the IC's Ishak Institute in Singapore, when they do their annual this is an elite survey, where I think in the last one, India ranked 9th out of 11 dialogue partners. So the mean score was just over 5 out of 10, and some people noted this was below even Russia, even though India's significance, if you look at it strategically, as you pointed out, is higher than Russia if you look at the overall relationship. Now, it's very difficult, and I'm always very skeptical when it comes to taking one data point or two data points in a very sophisticated series of relationships that, as you pointed out, have evolved over multiple decades, not a single year or 2 years or 3 years. But I'm wondering, how do we, sort of make sense of this kind of mixed bag, and particularly from your experience as a practitioner who's looking at this over several decades? How do we understand the mix of kind of opportunities and challenges? And it goes back to the question of if we were to grade India on its defense ties with Southeast Asia, are we talking sort of in the A range, the B range, or is it, a scale of 1 to 10? How would you kind of assess that, given the fact that we want to pay attention to these data points, But we also want to make sure that the headlines are kept in perspective and we're viewing things in terms of how they were before and how they're evolved over multiple decades rather than just, a few months or just one data point or two data points.
Well, that's a good point. In fact, the survey report of April 2024, which you mentioned on the state of Southeast Asia, it's a bit of a wake-up call, number one. But then if you look at it, if the bilateral engagements are so strong, then this sort of is a pointer to India to say that, look, when you compare with other countries, this is where, in the pecking order, perhaps this is where you will rank if the nation has to make a choice. And if strategic relevance, if I remember the figure, it is 5.04, which sort of placed India in the bottom three with New Zealand and Canada. And I don't know if that's how good a feel-good factor that will be, but considering that Canada is on the other side of the Pacific Ocean as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, and of course New Zealand is on the other side of Australia as we look at it from India. So it's a sort of a wake-up call that if you are going to look at getting into competition without getting into a sort of a conflict with other nations, with China ranks very high. So, that's sort of it's a call that says, all right, if China is considered a problem nation in the South China Sea, what merits it to rank so high? So I'll just give you an example. In India's financial year of 22-23, China crossed the US as India's largest trading partner with a trade deficit of $80 billion, where US was number one before that, and we had an advantage of the trade deficit was in our favor. So now when you are faced with a nation with that sort of economic heft, and BRI was one example I'd like to say, but you know how things are panning out. Sri Lanka is one example, and there are other nations who sort of are into that debt trap. But the fact is that if China delivers, and here we're talking about deliverables, if China delivers at a certain rate which is the lowest, then any nation would obviously want to go for it. The quality issues are separate. There are a lot of nations who are now complaining that the defense equipment which they procured from China has run into problems, and Pakistan is one of them, although they are all-weather allies with friends with China. So how do you beat that? So on a one-to-one, if relations are good, and I just get back to the figure of a 300 million credit line given to Vietnam, so what all can Vietnam take which will be worth $300 million, which will enhance its defense standing, which will enhance its capacity capability? What is it that they will want from us? That's one. And number two is, how sustainable is it? Which means that our own defense industry has to sort of keep pace with the requirements which are coming. Numbers always matter. When you look at defense industry, they're always looking at numbers, because more the numbers, more the sales, more the profit. So it's a question that, can we say compare ourselves with China? At today's point, I would say no, but we will in some time hopefully enter the top 10 nations who export defense equipment. So that's one example. So economic heft is important. But the other thing is that if we are looked upon as of little strategic value, given the figures that report states, then is there something wrong in our approach? Are we sort of, we stand with strategic autonomy, we don't believe in alliances, we believe in strategic relationships. But strategic relationships can do only that much to a certain point. To cross that line, you need then an alliance. There are lots of things that alliances will give you which strategic relationships cannot. But that's the way we look at it as researchers and analysts. So is there a modicum of changing the manner of strategic relations, imbibe aspects that alliances provide without using the word alliance? I think that's an approach that India should look at, and which means that maybe taking a stronger stance, getting back to the South China Sea, perhaps being more vocal about certain situations. I mean, what the nations are facing in the South China Sea is what we face on the land border with China. There is no difference. The only thing is that it's land and that is water, and then of course the elements are different. But the nature of facing China remains the same. And only those nations who have a common border with China will perhaps understand it. And China's entry into the Indian Ocean region is a risk that has to happen. If you believe in freedom of navigation, you cannot just block Malacca Strait and says China not permitted. Goes against the customary and accepted international laws, and that's something that at least India would not like to do, because it stands by its recognition of international laws and conventions. So perhaps there's a need to relook our Act East policy. Perhaps we need to engage better. Deliverables are important. We have faulted at some point in time of not delivering at the right time or not delivering at all. So that is, I think, something that we have overcome in the past, but it needs to be enhanced and improved. And although these studies do indicate certain things, and how to increase the grading, well, you did ask me a question on a scale of 1 to 10. I would say in bilateral relationships, on a 1-to-1 relationship, I think we're doing very good, 8 to 9. Because it's not only defense, it's economics, there is trade, there is culture, there are so many issues. People-to-people relations is another issue. And if you look at the volume of Indian tourists who are now going to Vietnam, which is now turned into a very, a lot of global tourists go to Vietnam now, and it's opened up, is an indication of relations to come. Need to keep the foot on the pedal, need to keep improving, innovating, opening new areas of investment, even if it means that your bilateral relations with perhaps another nation, let's say with China, takes a little hit. I mean, how lower can it fall than it is right now? Sorry. So we need to relook from time to time, our Act East policy. There is the Cabinet Committee on External Affairs that in 2023 did a study of India's neighborhood first policy. A number of recommendations are there. And if we see the state of India's neighborhood, it's just about okay. We've got Sri Lanka, we're supporting them, acknowledges the effort put in by India, especially the credit line given after the debt issue with China. We have Bangladesh, which is in a pickle right now. And of course, it's always good to have a friendly nation, a friendly government in power. But, well, things happen. Mm-hmm. So how does India look at Bangladesh? And to give you a parallel, the example with relations with Malaysia. Relations with Malaysia around a decade over, all right, not so good, but now they've improved. And so when you have a friendly government in power, that's the time that you need to actually make progress. And if you're faced with, say, a government which is not too okay with you, then you need to build new relationships, build new bridges. To give the example of Maldives. So we gave Maldives the area to maneuver, because of course the election manifesto had a sort of an anti-India element to it, but we give them space to maneuver. And anybody who engages with India knows that we're quite a good country to engage with. You know, we don't go back on many of our promises, or we do deliver, we do help, we're there. And again, as I said, it's a question of stability, security, and peace. So, on again bilateral 1-to-1, very good. But if India's standing in comparison with other nations is so low, then you are in a competition and you need to improve your standing. And that's what foreign relations is all about. So there is work for us to do, and there is scope for a lot of engagements. And we go through the IPOI, or we go through the Quad related, or even if we go through the various ASEAN platforms, you know, the East Asia Summit or any other issues. Trilaterals, I'm a great fan of trilaterals. Perhaps trilaterals or minilaterals is the issue. In fact, I'm going to be in Perth next week and talking about Indian Ocean minilaterals. End of August, I'm going to be there. And I think it's going to be an interesting exercise, because there are going to be around 12 nations there, including some all Indo-Pacific nations. We've got small island nations to nations like India, Japan, France, Australia. So it's going to be a good exercise. So trilaterals is another way in which perhaps India's standing can be increased. And as I said, if I put on a bilateral scale of 8 to 9, then in competition standards, if you go by the SEA report of April 2024, I'd peg it around 2 and 3, but we can push it up to 7 and 8, but it will take time.
No, that's a great point that you made, especially about viewing these relationships and engagement more comprehensively. Because I think even if I compare my own personal experience going to Vietnam and the number of Indians you see on flights 10 years ago relative to now, I think you can feel the change, the connectivity changes that are happening in the region. So viewing kind of defense-related developments as kind of isolated from the broader relationship is probably missing a lot of that picture as well. So it's a very integrated region and a very diverse and sophisticated one. So I appreciate the point that you made there. You sort of talked a little bit about gazing into the future with respect to some of these mechanisms, including minilaterals, and you also mentioned the South China Sea, and I'm wondering if we could pursue that a little bit. If we see sort of, gazing a little bit into the future, you mentioned this as well in your comments, that India has been a little bit wary in terms of its rhetoric on the South China Sea historically, but we have seen of late India being a little bit more forthright. One development that happened quite recently, a few months ago, was when India's Foreign Minister Jai Shankar made some comments during the Philippine stop of his wider visit to Southeast Asia that also included Malaysia and Singapore. But I also want to sort of get to the other components you mentioned as well, the events and developments that are happening on the water beyond just the rhetoric. So if we're looking at things strategically and looking ahead, how do we think about India's role in the South China Sea, not just in terms of what it's doing with individual countries, but as you correctly pointed out, how does this interact with its minilateral pursuit, its neighborhood first policy? Because in the sort of balance of power logic, we are sort of dealing with this notion that as we're seeing linkages between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, we do have China playing a lot more of a role in the Indian Ocean. And that also means that, and India is playing a larger role in the South China Sea as well. India has stakes there, not just on defense, but also with respect to Vietnam, if you look at energy, for example. So there are various linkages that we're looking at in terms of China playing more of a role in the Indian Ocean, India playing more of a role in the South China Sea. Can I ask how you would view sort of different scenarios with respect to India's future engagement in the South China Sea within this kind of complex web of engagements that you talked about?
So when you look at the South China Sea, essentially when